The right to protest no longer exists in this country. That's not hyperbole, that's an accurate summary. Protest has now de facto been redefined as a privilege which is arbitrarily dispensed by the police, an institution which cannot, in any meaningful way, be trusted to protect our freedoms. Indeed, it itself has a profoundly anti-democratic culture, which I'll explain. Now, this weekend, peaceful protesters at the King's Coronation who support an elected head of state, and bear in mind the Republican cause in this country, according to polls, has the support of about a quarter of the population. That's about 15 million British adults in this country. They were arrested. Now, 6 of them belong to the protest group Republic, who campaign for a democratically elected head of state, including its leader, Graham Smith, despite having liaised with police in advance of the protest. Indeed, they were in contact, as ITV has revealed, with the Met back in January and met with the Met in March. They weren't just arrested, they were held for 16 hours. Now, anyone who knows anything about the protest group Republic know they engage entirely in peaceful protest. So what was the basis for the arrests of these self-evidently peaceful protesters? Well, you see, the Tories introduced a piece of legislation called the Public Order Act, which criminalises what is called locking on. That is the act of attaching yourself to a target, for example, with cuffs, or, and this is also very important, criminalises what is perceived to be the intent of locking on. Now, Republic had a load of banners with straps holding them together. Anyone who knows anything about placards knows this is just something which is used in order to organise your placards. Now, they were construed by the police as equipment for locking on, and so they were all arrested, deprived of their right to exercise peaceful protest, and detained for 16 hours. As Graham Smith tweeted after he was finally freed, "We've just been told that the police will be taking no further action. This has been a disgraceful episode and we will be talking to lawyers about taking legal action. I also expect a full inquiry into why they repeatedly lied to us and who authorised the arrests." Do you see what happens? Do you see what's happened here? See, every time legislation is introduced to deal with protests in this country, or indeed just generally with civil liberties, opponents say, always warn, that those will go, the legislation will go further than whatever the alleged remit is, that they will be used to criminalise, more broadly, basic freedoms and rights like protest. And those opponents are dismissed as scaremongering, hyperbole, but every time they're vindicated. We're always vindicated. All of these pieces of legislation, introduced by Conservatives and New Labour, who themselves were profoundly aggressive in clamping down on civil liberties, the consequence of that has been to gradually asphyxiate our freedoms in this country. The right to protest, rather than it being a privilege which is arbitrarily dispensed by the police, as I've said, is dead in this country. Now, another piece of legislation the Tories introduced, the Policing Act, criminalised what's known as noisy protests. Protests are supposed to be noisy. It's the point of a protest. You know, again, just legislation intended to criminalise the right to protest. Now, the 6 Republic protesters were released without charge, and the police have expressed their regret and have apologised to those arrested. Not good enough, obviously, and Graham Smith and his colleagues are rightly taking further action against these gangsters. It's too late in any case, because obviously the effect of these high-profile arrests is to have a chilling effect on other people, deterring them from exercising their right, because they quite rationally fear that if they engage in peaceful protest, they are liable to be arrested and detained for what? 16 hours for absolutely nothing. Now, initially, it was claimed apparently by the Met that they were arrested on conspiracy to cause a public nuisance. It was only later they said the Public Order Act. These people can't even get their stories straight, can they? We'll come on to this, how you can never trust these people unless you're an absolute clown. Now, let's just hear Graham Smith talk about what happened.
Well, at the time, we were simply unloading placards from our van. We were immediately descended upon by a large number of police officers from the, I believe they're called the TSG, a particular group of officers, and they immediately stopped us from unloading, detained us, searched us and the van. They told us that they were going to arrest us on suspicion of being equipped to lock on, which was untrue. There was nothing that we had in our possession that could have allowed us to lock on. They then took us and held us for 16 hours. And there was absolutely, they also said they had intelligence, which is untrue. If they did have intelligence, their intelligence officers are either lying or incompetent, because there was never any discussion, thought, email, message, anything that suggested any intent to do anything disruptive.
They also, I mean, look, honestly, I just don't even know where to go with this. They also arrested volunteers handing out rape alarms at 2 a.m. in Soho. These were members of Westminster Council's Night Lives safety team who work with the Met. Let's just hear one of those volunteers, Riz.
Hi, my name is Riz. I was racially targeted last night and arrested by the police. I volunteer with the Westminster Council and Metropolitan Police community, working with something called Night Stars, which is this. And as you can clearly see, it says Westminster Night Stars with Metropolitan Police.
Now, this was based on supposed intelligence, according to the Met, that protests intended to disrupt the coronation, to basically literally scare the horses with rape alarms. This so-called intelligence was splashed in the Mail on Sunday. A rag. Just a rag. Now, as the journalist Mick Wright writes, the press reports were sourced to the Met. The head of the Met's comms team is an ex-Mail journalist, and the front page story about rape alarms was in the Mail on Sunday. There's a long history of police collaboration, different police forces who've lied over and over again, or just misled or distorted the truth in collaboration with certain journalists who don't see their position, these specific journalists, as critiquing power, but are accomplices of power. Now, let's just hear scrutinise this argument that rape alarms would be used to scare police horses. Absolutely preposterous. Let's just hear from the Labour MP Barry Gardner, who tore this story to pieces on television.
What about the part of the legislation that said if it was noisy to such an extent that somebody might be disturbed by it?
Well, you obviously know that if the example of this weekend, what the Met thought had happened were alarms being used which could have frightened horses, which could have created unsafe and disruptive.
Seb, let's be clear. Those horses have trumpets on them. They have drums on them. The idea that loud noises are going to frighten those horses is really not credible, is it?
But let me be very clear about this. Anyone who believes what the Met says is either a stooge or a dupe. Now, the Met have said it was not our intention to prevent protest. It is very clear a number of protests took place across the footprint, both before, during and after the event, with no police intervention. Any suggestion all protests were prohibited is not correct. What did the Met say before these protests, before the coronation? They said our tolerance for any disruption, whether through protest or otherwise, will be low. We will deal robustly with anyone intent on undermining this celebration. It sounds as menacing as it was clearly intended to be. Now, the Met have been found to be homophobic, misogynist and racist, institutionally homophobic, misogynist and racist by a recent inquiry. They have an authoritarian mindset. You may have heard of the thin blue line. Now, this is this view that the police often present themselves as the bulwark against society collapsing into violent anarchy. And they often see this violent anarchy as ranging from a kind of so-called underclass, which they often racialise and see particularly as specific minorities, and what they see as protesters who they regard as ne'er-do-wells and troublemakers who are there posing a dangerous threat to the status quo. They're not fit to defend democratic principles. They are riddled with an anti-democratic culture. The sorts of people the police attract themselves disproportionately have an authoritarian mindset. But they are de facto in charge of whether our basic democratic right to protest can happen. Now, listen to this. Honestly, I cannot even believe this. Mark Rowley, the Commissioner of the Met Police, wrote defending his disgusting police force's actions. He says, officers have told me how the celebrating crowd applauded and cheered as they made 17 arrests in the mall area close to the processional route and imminent to the start of the procession. What's the significance of that then? What, a baying mob of, a royalist crowd, the fact they roared their approval at police action? What does that have to do with anything? I mean, how is that? Is that now a litmus test that if you have, in this particular case, probably a pretty conservative crowd celebrating the arrest of people whose views they object to? So, I mean, what are they trying to say? They're just they're the police wing of the monarchist movement or something. Now, the right, as I've said, given the right to protest has been shut down by the Conservatives, we can expect Labour to rise to the rescue, can't we? Let's just hear what Sir Keir Starmer, Leader of the Opposition, had to say about the Public Order Act.
Wouldn't a Labour government repeal the Public Order Act? I mean, if Labour... I mean, the whole history of Labour is a history of protest.
Well, I think there are two things going on here. On the one hand, I think most people say the police need powers to deal with Just Stop Oil and some of their tactics. They do need powers to deal with that. But on the other hand, there's a balance to be had, which is to protect free, and peaceful protest. Operational decisions were made over the weekend. Some were right, some were wrong. The police themselves have accepted that a number of them were wrong. That needs to be a learning experience. Legislation needs to bed down.
But you won't repeal the Act?
Well, I think we need to let it bed in. Yeah. We need to look at how it operates in practice. Very often with public order legislation, as you know, there's a period of bedding in. Just because the police have got a power, it doesn't mean they have to use it in every situation. Yeah. Guidance emerges. Yeah. So we haven't even got to that stage yet, and I think we need to get to that stage.
So there you have it, an authoritarian conservative clampdown on our basic democratic rights, and Starmer refuses to reverse it. Mr U-turn strikes again, a man who made a series of pledges in his leadership campaign, which he then abandoned. A few months ago, Labour voted against this bill, and now he wants to bed it in. You see, this is the point about Labour and its current leadership is, it's not just that they're bad social democrats, which they are. They have a weak commitment to redistributing wealth and power. They're bad liberals as well. They have a weak commitment to defending our freedoms, in other words. Now, what that means in practical terms is we don't have an opposition which is able or willing to defend our democratic rights from a hard right conservative onslaught. We can't expect them to restore our rights and our freedoms. And obviously we can look back, at New Labour's record of clamping down on civil liberties, given Starmer's leadership has positioned itself as the continuity wing of New Labour. So we can expect many of the same people now from that government are back in place and advising the Labour Party. And also Labour, a few months ago, last year, condemned the Conservatives for not clamping down on climate protesters with enough zealotry. Now, our democratic rights are in a state of steep decline. The danger is the creation of what is called by Hungary's far-right leader an illiberal democracy, where you strip away the substance of democracy, the democratic culture, and you keep merely the trappings. And in my darker moments, I do fear that this country will end up a little like Hungary. Now, our ancestors, the giants on whose shoulders that we stand, they fought for our rights. They fought for our rights at such cost and such sacrifice. Rights and freedoms which took generations, centuries to achieve. Fought for by people who were whacked by police batons, beaten, tortured, thrown into dirty cells for months, years, decades. And yes, those who lost their lives fighting for our rights and our freedoms. And yet these rights and freedoms, won at such cost and such sacrifice, over such long periods of time, can be stripped away, chipped away in weeks with barely a murmur. We owe it to our ancestors who fought for rights and freedoms we have taken for granted and allowed our rulers to strip away. We owe it to them to defend those rights and freedoms. Labour's not going to do it. The Tories are going to keep assaulting our democracy. We, the people, have to do something to build a movement that can restore democratic rights and freedoms, restore the right to protest as a right, rather than, as I said, as a privilege dispensed by the anti-democratic institution that is the police. Because this is, my friends, how freedom dies. When people are unwilling to defend rights and freedoms that their ancestors fought for, where they stand aside passively and allow authoritarian politicians and their media allies to shut down rights and freedoms, because if they don't feel there is any pushback, they will feel encouraged to keep on going and to keep coming for our rights and freedoms. And if you don't like that, I think it's time to do something about it. Please like, subscribe, and do support us on patreon.com/OJ84. I'll see you in a bit.